Good evening. Tonight I wanted to talk about something that I know you'll find interesting. The book, The Temptations by Otis Williams, who was the founder of The Temptations, the awesome Motown group, one of the really central bands in the history of Motown music, which is one of the great forms of American pop music ever. I'm an old Detroit boy, so I'm kind of partial to it anyway. And also, as important or more important, the miniseries that was based on that book, The Temptations. It came out in 1998. I highly recommend this. It's a television miniseries. It's about 3 hours long. You can watch it in one sitting, really, or two comfortably. It's an excellent series that tells the story of the Temptations. I recommend them both. And the miniseries actually follows the book pretty well, considering it's a television miniseries. You know, they have to adapt for the television format and so on. But it's a fine series, and it really makes you appreciate the excellence and the beauty of the Motown sound in general and the Temptations in general. You know, Otis Williams is an interesting guy. The passages from this book are kind of laced throughout the film too. So the film does incorporate the book pretty directly in a lot of areas, even though it's not entirely accurate all the time, from what I understand. But he was kind of an interesting guy. He never really was the big lead singer star of the band, but he was the guy that started the band, that organized it, and kind of led the band. And so in that ways, in that sense, he's probably the most important figure in the history of the Temptations. He kind of started it. When they went through a lot of turmoil, he was kind of the guy who always sort of had the guiding hand and kept everybody's eye on the band, not the different dramas that were going on with the different members. But he always had that vision of the band. And he's probably a reason that the band came into being, or he is the reason that the band came into being. And as importantly, he's the reason probably the band is still around. I thought they did a good job depicting him in the book as a strong leader, a good team player too. You know, that was one of the themes that comes out in the movie, is the Temptations were a group. So it was a team. You know, they had their stars. They had David Ruffin, Eddie Kendricks, you know, Paul Williams. Those were all kind of stars, but they were a team, and he was a team player. Like I said, it's kind of interesting. He never was the big star, but you know, he didn't sing lead on many of their songs, but he was always in there kind of providing leadership. But the miniseries is really good. It's set in Detroit. A lot of it's set in Detroit. Some of the later sections are set in Los Angeles. But it's really neat to see a depiction of Detroit back in the heyday of the 50s. I guess really it was still a pretty vibrant city compared to, you know, what people think of Detroit now. It was full of clubs. Chappie's Lounge is mentioned in there. That's kind of a famous Detroit club where a lot of good music came out of, and that's in the movie, actually. The Temptations played there a number of times. But yeah, unfortunately, they actually filmed it in Pittsburgh because of the you know, a lot of the old types of neighborhoods and things that would have been in Detroit in the 50s were have been either bulldozed or aren't in good enough shape to show. So they actually filmed it in Pittsburgh, which is kind of too bad. But they do have some scenes in Hitsville, USA, which is the famous Motown house. So they do have a few scenes in Detroit, but a lot of the Detroit street scenes and so on were actually filmed in Pittsburgh. One of the things you see in the band, the lineup kind of takes shape. Otis Williams, they have Otis and the Siberians, and he kind of had his friend, this Elgin Bryant, and they kind of start the group, and then they pick up this bass singer named Melvin Franklin, Blue. He was known affectionately as Blue, but by his bandmates. And they kind of go through the drama of how they pick up Paul Williams and Eddie Kendricks, who were singing with a young unknown star named Diane Ross originally. So that was kind of neat. And they kind of go through all that. And there's a lot of that early Detroit music scene and a lot of pretty good detail. It really is worth watching for the history of it. There's a woman in there named Johnny Mae Matthews, who I hadn't heard of before, but she was kind of a Detroit figure in the music scene, and she kind of was their first manager. I think they imply maybe she was, kind of taking advantage of them in some ways, but she liked them, and, she kind of helped them get a start anyway. The big break came when they met Berry Gordy in a men's room. According to this, they met him in a men's room, kind of somewhat made fools of themselves, trying to introduce themselves to the great Berry Gordy, and he gave them a card. And that was sort of the beginning of their contact with Motown. And before too long, they had a record contract with Motown as the Temptations. But I want to say a little bit about Berry Gordy, and he was another figure that I found very compelling in the movie. He lived in Detroit. I don't think he was born in Detroit, but he was basically a Detroiter. He, moved there and was living there and working there. And he used to work on the auto line in the Motor City back, when they had that was one of the big industries there. And he got the idea, if you can make a car, with this kind of assembly line, we can do that with stars. So he would kind of bring in people that he saw had talent, but were kind of in the raw, and he would teach them how to dance. He would teach them how to talk to people. He would teach them how to smile. He would, help them do their hair right, everything. And then he had a closet full of clothes, so go find a tuxedo that fits you. It was all kind of laid out. And that guy started Motown Records, with some money he borrowed from his family, and when he was working on the line. That's got to be one of the great American success stories I can think of, and so much good music. And he started in that little house, Motown, that's today Hitsville, USA. That little house, they had a little recording studio in there, and he had that little band that he kind of put together over time, the Funk Brothers, which is one of the great session teams of the 20th century, like the Wrecking Crew, the guys that played in the Brill Building, Muscle Shoals. The Funk Brothers are right up there with any of them. They just played on so many records, it's ridiculous. A lot of people would hear all those different groups, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, the Temptations, the Supremes, all those bands. They wouldn't realize it's the Funk Brothers were basically playing all that stuff, and then they would have singers that sang it. So very inspiring. And Berry Gordy had a little, kind of like, again, the Factory, he had a little quality control team. He'd bring in a diverse group of people, and he would play them a song, and he would say, if you had $1 and you were starving to death, would you buy this record or a bologna sandwich? And if they said a bologna sandwich, you'd pass on the song. But, when they said, hey, if I had $1, I'd buy that song, he knew that was a hit, and a lot of times he was right. So he finally ended up signing the Temptations. And it's kind of an exciting thing. You see the early years of the band. One of the most interesting parts of the film I found was the story of David Ruffin. David Ruffin actually joined the band when this Bryant quit and/or was fired. It was kind of one of those, you can't fire me, I quit. You can't quit, you're fired situations, but he was drinking some and I guess not behaving professionally. And anyway, whatever the personal drama was, he was fired and they replaced him with David Ruffin, who had some minor success as a solo artist. David Ruffin, in the film and in real life, you can look at him, was a great singer, really one of the major figures in Detroit music history. Also kind of a troubled guy. It seems like maybe he was one of those guys that would be kind of temperamental, like a lot of great singers are. But as soon as he came into the group, they he was the guy that sang "My Girl." He sang "Ain't Too Proud to Beg." I think early on, Eddie Kendrick sang "The Way You Do the Things You Do." He had that really high voice. Of course, later Eddie Kendricks would have a hit in the early '70s with "Keep On Truckin', Babe." I was kind of moving into rock and roll by then, but he had that really high, sweet falsetto voice, and he sang on some of their song hits too. He was kind of the lead singer. But when David Ruffin came on, he had that really powerful, masculine voice. There's nothing wrong with a little masculinity here and there, and he had that really strong male voice. He could really belt out a song, and yet with heart. So it appealed to a lot of people. They always say a lot of women would like the way he sang, because he had such a powerful, strong man's voice. But he was hard to work with anyway, I guess, and he also developed a drug problem. So you kind of see the David Ruffin saga develop during the story. And I thought the actor, I guess his name is Leon, but he did a terrific job. He's just outstanding in this role. And David Ruffin, you kind of follow him throughout the story, and you sort of you can see why the Temptations couldn't have him in the group anymore. I mean, and you could see why some of the members voted to kick him out, because they have a vote and they kick out David Ruffin even after he'd sung "My Girl," sung "Ain't Too Proud to Beg." You can kind of understand it, and yet you kind of see his talent, and the things that made him great are also evident whenever you see him on camera. And I thought the actor did a terrific job really capturing the sort of complexity of David Ruffin. And the film also shows David Ruffin's tragic death. David Ruffin ended up in the 80s on some Temptations reunion tours, which were often kind of short-lived, partially because David Ruffin sometimes wouldn't show up for gigs and things like that. But then he was, there are different versions of what happened, but he was dropped off at a hospital, emergency room, I guess, or they took him in there. I don't know, you'll hear different things. But he died, and his body wasn't claimed for a while, I guess. I don't know. Again, you'll hear different things. But it was very sad. But he's buried in Detroit, and I know that's one of the important graves in the Detroit music scene, a city that gave us Aretha Franklin and so many other important people. But the movie is very good. I thought the guy that did David Ruffin was everybody in this film is excellent. Everybody in this film is excellent, but the guy that did David Ruffin really stands out as really creating a memorable character. And like a lot of memorable characters, not a perfect person. It's not. You could see why he was a piece of work. But you could also kind of see his greatness. As soon as he joined the band, they kind of took off, and they did, they had a number of lineup changes after he left, and they had some great singers. I think Dennis Edwards, and but it's just a really, really good depiction of David Ruffin and the dynamic. But the guy that plays Otis Williams and Melvin Franklin, they sort of also, and Paul Williams and Eddie Kendricks, they all are just do a superb job depicting their roles. After David Ruffin leaves, it's one of my favorite periods of the Temptations, and that music of that period, pop music, is psychedelic soul, and they do like Papa Was a Rolling Stone, I'm Doing Fine on Cloud 9, Psychedelic Shack, that's where it's at. It was Hard Times, I Was Born and Raised in the Slums of the City. Those are some great songs, and the music was changing, and so it was kind of neat. It was soul music, R&B music, but it had like wah-wah pedals and things in it that made it really, really cool and gave it a kind of a new, fresh sound. Today we might see it as kind of dated, but it was really cool, edgy sound, but still really catchy melodic elements and so on that the Temptations were known for, and great harmonies. A Ball of Confusion. When they recorded Papa Was a Rolling Stone, that's in the film, and Norman Whitfield was the songwriter in that period that wrote several of their kind of songs in that period, another great Motown songwriter, and they show that. And so anyway, the soundtrack is great. Actually, they use quite a few of the Temptations' original recordings in the film, and I think they redid some. But you can enjoy it almost as a concert movie. There's great dancing, singing in it. The music is top notch. So it's a really good, it's a musical in the sense that it really incorporates the music and does it well within the parameters of the story. So the soundtrack is great. I mean, if you're going to do a Temptations movie, you'd better have a good soundtrack. If you screw that up, you know, I don't care how good the acting is, or, if you screw up the music of the show, yeah, you blew it, 100%. And they didn't. The music in it is great. So, so I guess if you had one criticism, some of the middle sections towards the end, after their kind of heyday, it goes through some of the deaths of the group, as sad as those were, death of Melvin Franklin. Paul Williams commits suicide, but it gets a little long. I guess it's not as fun to watch as their rise and all the David Ruffin stuff, but it's part of the story, and I think to finish the story you need that. But there is kind of, just like the band, when the band's famous and young and hot, that's kind of fun to watch. And then when they're aging and kind of dying off, and you see a lot of that part of it, and they're not having hits anymore. That's still fun to watch. It's still good, but maybe it's not quite as fun to watch as those earlier sections. But I highly recommend this. It's excellent. Another scene in there is when they get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And, of course, David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks were on the outs with the band at the time, and they show up. And they say, we just want to come and get our award, and the rest of the Temptations, what are you going to say? You're not going to let David Ruffin get up there when he sang Ain't Too Proud to Beg and My Girl? I mean, if you tell the guy who sang My Girl he can't go up and get an award with the Temptations. So they kind of, for one night, got along and went up there, and everybody was honored. But a great band. It made me proud to be from Detroit. Made me kind of sad in some ways. When those scenes, the way they depicted all those, strong, healthy young guys with so much talent and energy. Berry Gordy with his sort of vision and leadership, starting Motown with a piddly little loan from his sister. It's a great story. It made me feel kind of bad for Detroit, but I don't want to get into the saga of Detroit. I hope Detroit's on the up, but it's a great story, a story of energy and talent and vision and leadership. And this Otis Williams book goes into a lot more depth, as you can imagine. And if you have time to read it, I recommend that. But if you don't, I definitely recommend this miniseries. I actually, there are a lot of music biopics out there. and I think this is one of the best ones I've seen. And I don't, I've thought about that, but I think it's really one of the best ones I've seen. It's very well done. Everything in it, the music, the acting, the way they crafted the story, because that's pretty hard to tell a story that takes 20 years and stick it into a three-hour miniseries. The writing has to be pretty good. Not just good like William Shakespeare good, but also you have to fit everything together so it makes sense and flows, and you have to know what to leave out and what to put in and all that kind of stuff. Excellent. Highly recommend The Temptations and Otis Williams. And of course, I know you've already heard some. If you haven't, you've been living under a rock. But listen to some Temptations and any Motown and just be reminded of the greatness of the music that came out of that city in the 1960s and on into the early 70s. God bless you.
Yeah.